Thank you. All right, so we'll get this March 27th workshop underway. There are a couple of counselors who are in another meeting, and they'll be kind of heading down here as soon as they're able to. We have other counselors who are away. I can assure you that all counselors, they have their books, and this will not be the first and only time that we have a chance to review the budget. So that will be happening.
Apologies.
You're right on.
Quite all right.
I just said 2 counselors would appear.
Here we are.
There you go. And I will apologize in advance. Thursday, I will not be able to be here. So, any counselors want to ask questions, make comments before we get started?
I had one quick question, which I asked Glenn, but I was still a little bit confused about for the admin meeting, which I watched on the video yesterday, about the finance department budget. I just didn't understand, are we asking to hire a new person to be either the accountant or the operations manager? Or you're just talking
No.
about redistributing the human beings you already have to?
No,
for
I
that?
need to hire an accountant. As far as the operations, that was just a discussion that I had with the clerk about having someone that could kind of liaise between all these departments with,
Yeah.
especially things like payroll and purchasing, just policies that are citywide, but some people are a lot closer to them than others and are more familiar with them. Just to try to maintain that uniformity in compliance with the policies that we have.
And so in the line, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find it, in the line.
I actually
item-
didn't do that budget, so it does need to be amended.
Oh, okay.
So hopefully we'll get to meet about it again.
Okay, sounds
Yeah.
good. I just didn't see like a big enough increase in the payroll
Yeah.
to account for another human,
No,
but you're
it's-
saying that's
but
just
it-
not in
But it's
there.
not another person. We're not hiring
We're not-
another person. We're gonna have 4 people in the finance department.
Yeah,
Right now, our focus is to find someone with an accounting degree and accounting experience to fill what was the deputy finance
I
director
see, a
role.
role
Yeah.
that already
A role
exists.
already
Yeah.
exists.
I
That
just
was
wanna
what I didn't
change the,
understand. Okay,
the composition of that person.
that makes sense. Okay, got it. That was my only question.
Anyone else? All right.
All right. So before we get into the budget tonight we're dealing with public safety, so that consists of police, fire, and dispatch. But before we get into those, and before you leave tonight, the pile of pages in front of you are things that needed to be changed since the last meeting. There were recommended some changes, so those are reflected in those pages. The entire fire budget that you have was an old budget printout prior to our meeting with the fire department, so that you should be working from that document tonight, not what's in your book. And in addition to that, I think there was some public works stuff that was omitted from the book that's now included in that the additional information I gave you. So after the meeting tonight, you're gonna wanna go through your book, and any page you're getting a new one for, make sure you tear out the old one and go with what's been given to you tonight, because that's the most accurate and up-to-date information thus far. And there'll be many more changes to come. Since I've got to be here for the duration, we'll start out with fire and allow them to come up and they can present their budget.
Good evening.
And again, the fire you're going to be wanting to work from is what was given to you tonight.
So the current, these aren't, is there some way to differentiate, can these be dated in the future so we would know which ones is old and which ones are new? I realize it's easy to tear things out. I'm not one that wants
I
to
agree.
throw anything away.
Yeah, I already wrote the date on this, and so I will make a note to tell Tim.
Well, I just wondered if it just gets rid of some confusion. I'm not one that dares throw anything away. Is your budget 19%, or is your budget 20% over last year?
19.
19, okay, so I've got the right.
So I guess the biggest thing for us is if you've gone through ahead of time and taken a look at our budget proposal for this year, most of the changes are applicable to the personnel side of things, as far as increases and decreases. The one thing to add about this year is back this fall, we did a side agreement with the council to start the full-person, four-shift system. And so the addition of that additional firefighters included in this budget in order to bring all four shifts up to full personnel. Like I said, that was an agreement that was done this fall when we did the side agreement with the local 3402. We've gone through some of the payroll. We've done some considerable decreases in some areas, especially in terms of some areas that weren't being utilized from what was budgeted in the past. So we tried to conserve on that area. Questions about the personnel side of things?
Does that, the increases, it's not just due to the new, right?
It's not just due to the new firefighters, it's also due to the contractual percentage increases that come on annually.
There was a part-time payroll increase, but I read there were no additional part-time positions. Is that an increase within the same?
It's just an increase to cover. We have our volunteers, and because the volunteer base is starting to come back to more and more calls, we want to make sure that is covered as part of the budget. We also have one part-time employee who fills in to help cover and relieve some of that overtime cost that might be there on the backside. So she works very infrequently, but that's why we increased that, only that small amount.
So there's a small increase for volunteer?
Predominantly,
Take care of
yes.
them.
Yep.
Plus, we had to increase, we had several volunteers that were below minimum wage, paid, they're not volunteers, they're paid on call.
Correct.
We had several paid on call that were below minimum wage, so we had to increase their stipend, if you will, up to above, to meet the minimum wage standard. So that will result in a small increase there as well.
So moving on to contractual services, we did have some significant increases when you go through there. Predominantly, the cell phones are going to go up because of, one, we have the fire life safety inspector who's now back within the fire department, so we're covering his cell phone and his tablet. The ambulance is going to bring in a tablet, which means we're going to have to put a cell phone bill attached to that also. We already have tablets assigned to the engines, which is bringing an additional cell phone bill to it. So that is to cover the cost of using those tablets, which run off a cell system. Dues and membership, this also covers the fact that the fire and life safety inspector is back within the fire department. Between the deputy chief, myself, and the fire inspector, our dues with the organizations that we belong to have increased over the past year or so. So this was to accommodate those increases. Training expenses, training costs. This really covers the cost of continuing to train our firefighters, both the mandatories and continuing education. The same thing goes from the EMS. We want to make sure that we're continuing the education with our EMS providers, making sure they maintain their licenses over a year. So the chief officer development line, that is a new line that's added for the chief officers to have officer development, and so that we can continue to stay on top of the current trends and continue our training just as much as we're doing with the regular firefighters. Professional services, the biggest part of this is gonna be Northern Light. Northern Light's increase this year is 3% over last year. The next item that is of note is the mandatory physicals that we have to do with the firefighters every year. There's some other maintenance contracts that are involved there. Most of those fall in line with some of the equipment that we have to maintain every year. If we move down to vehicle equipment maintenance, if you notice, we don't need to increase that this year, from our perception. We've been able to, with a vehicle maintenance program, keep our costs down. So most of the items that we've had to deal with we've had some large items to deal with, but for the most part, with the vehicle maintenance program that we're doing, we're able to catch these things before they become more expensive. EMS supplies, we did ask for an increase with this. This is mostly due to the fact that, one, the cost of EMS supplies is going up considerably. The other part is that we have a contract with Northern Light to replace equipment, but when Northern Light does not do the transport, we have to assume the cost to replace that equipment ourselves. And so that's where we're running into that. And there's some equipment that we're not capable of replacing with Northern Light that also incurs a cost. Fuel costs, we felt this year that we need an increase an additional $10,000 to cover the cost of call volume, which is causing our fuel consumption to go up. Equipment and tools, we've only gone up about $3,000 over last year. Most of this is due to increases in the cost of supplies. Really if we go through this from an operational, minus the personnel side of things, and from the operational standpoint, we've kept our increases down considerably.
I want to bounce back to their payroll issue for just a second, because it is a pretty significant increase, but from last year's budget to this year's budget. And in addition to the changes that were made in their schedule, and that have required us to hire an additional firefighter, which is in this budget, the other change since last year is, as the fire chief alluded to, that fire inspector. So those of you who've been on the council for a few years remember that 2 years ago we took the fire inspector after Mike Hangy had retired, and our new fire inspector wasn't doing as much as what Mike Hangy did, because he didn't have the certifications. He wasn't doing the fire marshal inspections and things. So his office was in code. He had an interest in code. He had an experience in building as a background. And so the code enforcement officer at the time, who's since retired, approached me about working him into code enforcement, and for him, for that individual to become part of the code enforcement office and still do fire and life safety inspection, but also have a role in code as a deputy code enforcement officer. So when we made that change, his payroll went from the fire department to the code enforcement. This was 2 years ago. After that code enforcement officer retired, there was some changes in the code department. The fire and life safety inspector, the individual who was doing it, had a interest in being more involved with the fire department. He kind of regretted the fact that he was taken out of the fire department and wanted to be more involved with the fire department and the fire code and life safety and plans reviews. So after about a year of discussion and back and forth, the decision was made to relocate that fire and life safety inspector into the fire department under the supervision of the chief and deputy chief. And so as a result of that, this is the first fiscal year where that payroll for that individual is coming back into the fire department.
Have his duties changed, or it's just like where he sits and where he's?
Yeah, he
accounted
doesn't do
for?
any code stuff anymore. He's strictly fire and life safety. And he does the plans reviews for the city and does all of the inspections for the city. And he does serve. A couple weeks ago, both of our code enforcement officers were out sick, ill with COVID actually, and he was able to help do some code inspections for them. But on a daily basis, his responsibilities is strictly fire and life safety.
And code has been able to manage without him.
Yep. So code there was always two. There was just the deputy and the code enforcement officer and the deputy. And although they have a robust workload, they were always able to manage it. And then and Mike Hangy was the fire and life safety inspector. And then when Mike retired and the previous code enforcement officer, Dwight, retired, there was kind of a reshuffling of the deck. We moved an individual in there. Initially, her role was as sort of the office manager for the code enforcement officer and the deputy, who was also fire and life safety inspector. She has since grown and has achieved multiple different certifications and is actually now a deputy code enforcement officer. So we're back to par, we're back to the two, and the fire and life safety inspector has gone full-time back to the fire department to complete that role.
Just in terms of, with this role, are we, as a community, pretty timely in terms of meeting the needs of business around addressing any of the fire life safety issues when they're constructing, having this dedicated position? That just is an area that chronically is a problem statewide.
No, he's pretty responsive. As soon as he gets a call, he's either in the office and able to address the call, or he responds to them in a timely manner. If we get complaints, he addresses them very quickly. He's developed relationships with the business owners that's here in the area and is working through any of the discrepancies they may have in order to bring them into compliance without creating a enforcement side of things.
No, that's good. I just wanted to have a sense, just because they know across the state, it's an issue for
Yep.
community. So to have somebody dedicated is great for business if we're responsive.
I would generally agree with that as a business owner, from my part. I found that to be true.
And in addition, he's also, I know the chief and deputy chief, we've had a lot of conversations about his ability to, now that he's exclusively in the fire department, to work on some pre-planning and work with the fire department to go out to these businesses and inspect and provide information for the fire department in the event that we have, a large-scale event, or we have a fire in some of our bigger structures, fire escapes and other types of dangers. So to be able to go out and do some pre-planning on a lot of those facilities and bring that back to our fire department, and for them to be able to have that knowledge when and if we should ever have an incident in one of these buildings. So that's one of the projects that I know the deputy chief and the fire inspector have been working on, updating some of the information and making sure that's available. So.
Once you have the ambulance and then you get your certifications updated, then we will be able to bill for the emergency medical supplies, or some of them?
If we do a transport, we'll be able to bill for those transports that we
Yeah.
transport for, and then we can utilize that to basically use that for our supplies. Right.
And so have you factored that in, or you can't because you don't know
I
when
can't
that's
factor
gonna
that because
happen?
we don't have any data to pull from to do that.
The revenue from previous years, that 18,000, what is that?
That is typically, we have a contract with Fletcher's Landing for fire protection and EMS, and so we generate revenue from the county for their fire protection. And then That is our only revenue right now. We don't bill for services, for fire suppression services, so that current contract with Fletcher's Landing is typically our only source of revenue unless somebody is fined by forestry or something like that, where they're required through the courts to pay us back for services.
This isn't a budget question, but just a curiosity question. Once you get your ambulance and your license to transport, how, can you predict like how often that will happen? That you'll have a reimbursable call?
Any transport that we do is typically reimbursable, whether it's through private pay or whether it's through Medicare, Medicaid.
Yeah.
So if we do transport somebody, it's a billable transport.
So remind me, how many calls are you going out to now, like per day or per week?
So last year, we ran 1,344 EMS-related calls.
Yeah.
Based on what the state gave us for data, 950-plus calls were actual physical transports. So
In a
those
year.
would have been
Yeah.
billable calls.
Yeah, 950.
Mhm.
And we know from our meeting with Peninsula Ambulance a couple of weeks ago that they responded to 75 calls last year to the city of Ellsworth.
Okay.
So those were calls where Northern Light was not available, and they
Yeah,
were
and we
reaching
had
out to
to
mutual
call
aid.
and
So
stuff.
potentially, those 75, I don't know how many of those were transports, but those 75 calls, plus a few more that were covered by other ambulances, like, I don't know who else responds, Bar Harbor, Bucksport.
Bucksport, Sullivan.
So you could probably figure somewhere, rough figures, somewhere in the neighborhood to 80 to 90 calls that our ambulance will be the ambulance
That transport.
that needs to transport if transport is needed. And those are, very rough figures, but based on the mutual aid calls that we're experiencing from Northern Light to other ambulance services.
And that doesn't count the ones where Northern Light took 30 minutes and we would have transported
Correct.
them anyways. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
With that, this is where that developing a budget will come in handy, because part of it is, there's gonna be other costs that we don't currently have billing. It's gonna have some, whether it's outsourced or higher, there's a cost for that to be able to bill. There's a cost for all the administrative requirements that are gonna be necessary to be able to bill. So there's gonna be added time on the transport side and everything. So there's a lot to it to put together in terms of the billing is just part of it. There's also these new expenditures that at some point will need to be in the budget somewhere.
Which is why we're going baby steps.
Yeah.
We are literally just putting our toe in the water to see what it feels like.
Buy an ambulance to drive it around and see what it feels like.
Right.
I'm just kidding.
I'd like to ask a handful of questions. And I could ask one and give someone else a turn, or someone could shut me down. But this is only my second budget season, if you will. And when I look at individual budgets, I don't see anything that's unreasonable, but when I look at the aggregate amount that we have to bill Mr. or Mrs. Taxpayer, it seems like a lot. So when I look at individuals, I'm like, gee, how do you, it looks bare bones individually, but collectively, it's big money. And when I see a 19.5% increase, I think, I'm not saying that that it shouldn't have been 20 or 25, but it collectively, when you have to send those bills out, it's a hard pill to swallow.
Well, the hard part is that 17.6 of it is directly related to payroll.
I get it, but at the end of the day, it's still a bill that Mr. or Mrs. Taxpayer is gonna receive in the mail, or someone's gonna pay for it.
Right.
So my question is this, I noticed your capital budget is flat Looking ahead, it showed 15 last year and 15 this year, which is, I realize that's a different section, but it's still related to your department. 19% is a big hit. Whether it's personnel or whether it's whatever, it's a big hit. One question I have, and I'm not suggesting that anything change, is how much of this money being spent goes to personal conveyance of people taking city vehicles home?
It's only two people.
I realize it could be contractual, and it could be part of the pay, but I'm asking,
There's only 2 employees for the fire department who are authorized to take vehicles home, and we live here in the city.
okay. So that's on a daily basis?
Correct, but we also have a 24-hour response requirement.
Right, I'm not arguing either
Right.
way. I'm just trying to, in my mind, that's $1,000 a month per vehicle, it's 24 grand a year. It's a small amount when it comes to this budget.
Mhm.
And, so, and the availability of you jumping into a vehicle and going to, a scene is probably invaluable. So that's a small amount compared to this. I know you've already slimmed this down, but I just have to ask the question. 19%'s a lot. 19.5% is a lot. And again, we have to send this bill to Mr. or Mrs. Taxpayer. What value are we delivering to Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer that's an increase of 19%?
What value?
Yeah.
In terms of what? We've reduced our manpower to 4 on shift. We can't go any lower than that. I mean, you would jeopardize.
I'm asking, I guess what I'm asking is, in this increase of 19%, some of it's just economics, okay? But what extra things is Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer getting for this extra cost?
If I may, sir, part of the value they're getting is they're getting a highly trained crew that's gonna respond to their worst nightmare at any given time. We're different in that fact that we have, our crews are on duty 24 hours a day. Anytime they need to pick up the phone, dial 911, we're gonna respond. What may be a simple routine call to us is somebody's worst nightmare. And knowing that they have that ability to pick up that phone and get the help they need at the time they need it is probably the biggest value of anything. Think of the fire department, if you will, as a community insurance policy. You may not always need it, but you're really glad you have it when you do need it. And I think that's where the value comes from, is the strength, the quality, and the availability of the citizens of Ellsworth to pick up that phone and know that we're coming on a moment's notice.
Couldn't agree with you more, but I'm talking about the increase. I'm just asking if there is a value, if we had to sit in front of every taxpayer today, where is the extra 19%? Half of it is probably just surviving, correct, because of the cost of
Well,
everything
you
going
know,
up?
Exactly. I mean,
Right.
again, the payroll side of things, we've trimmed as much as we can trim. There is no more trimming in the payroll side of things. If you want to talk about the operational side of things, our operational budget was only a little over 1% increase, and if you tie that in with the inflation rate, we're under.
Okay.
We're not even covering what the cost of inflation has done to us. But we can't, the payroll part of things, we can't control. So I would love to be able to come in here and trim and be
Oh,
on the
yeah.
negative side of things, and I think, in working with the city manager, we actually have several lines that we decreased considerably in order to help compensate for that, because we knew that number was gonna be a big number.
I'm not disputing any of that. I'm just asking that question.
Right.
that-
So, if I may,
Yeah.
just a couple of things, a couple of added values that I see in this budget. One is the EMS role. Okay, so there's costs embedded in this, training expenses, materials, fuel. Those are all things that, that are gonna directly impact our ability to provide EMS service. So our
specifically ambulance?
Specifically
To put it
ambulance.
in layman's terms, specifically ambulance? That's what I'm looking for.
So-
I'm looking for those type of things that you can say, well, look, our budget's up, but we're delivering a bigger package here.
And so when you talk about your payroll and your payroll increases, I think to speak to your value, you can't ignore the fact that in order to maintain staffing levels, in order to attract and retain quality employees, we've been forced, it's more so in recent times than in past times, but we've been forced to make concessions. And during our contract negotiations, we were, up against a pretty tough negotiating in a time when, folks, and this, the same can be said for police as well, when folks aren't eagerly entering into emergency response types of jobs, police, fire, EMS. So in order to do that, we were forced in our negotiations to make some concessions, and along with pay, and now this new schedule, those were all efforts that were made in order to maintain our staffing levels, which is, as the fire chief and deputy chief have explained, is a huge benefit to our community to have highly trained, qualified individuals to respond to their calls. So, and in addition to that, as I stated before, around 60-some thousand, I don't know his exact salary, but around 60-some thousand of that salary increase is a result of that fire and life safety inspector. And as Chair Hamlin spoke about the added bonus of having that dedicated person in our community to be able to serve our citizens, and particularly our business owners, to go out and in a timely fashion to be able to provide the information that they need for their licensing and what have you, is definitely a bonus of having that individual. And that's reflected in this 19% increase because of that salary increase.
So we've got normal inflationary challenges, you've got ambulance, and you've got more training. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
That you're delivering to the taxpayer?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Yes.
But just to that point, just in terms of, because we didn't really go over this, we are, as you say, looking at it department to department. We'll come back to look at the overall city budget, but right now, the overall municipal side is an 8.6% increase from last year. So that 19% that you're talking about is being made up somewhere else. It's not carrying through. And on the fire side, rough numbers, that position that's been added or being added represents about a third of the increase. So you take that away, and you're still looking at a 12% increase that we have zero control over. The only control we would have is to eliminate personnel. So just to put it in context, that comes down to, that's the reality that the public needs to know, is that the only way to cut that 12% increase, or the 19%, is to eliminate positions. There's no other way to do it, because those are contractual issues that are moving forward.
I thought that additional person was grant funded for a year or some stretch
No,
of time?
we were not awarded the
We
SAFER
didn't win
grant.
that. Okay.
No. I would recommend that you allow me to apply for the SAFER grant for future positions, but as of right now, no. We were not awarded the grant, so the firefighter that we picked up in January was the one that we had budgeted for last year.
Right.
There was some small matching grant mentioned. Did I misread that?
You're probably referring to the SAFER grant that she was just discussing.
And maybe, yeah.
Yep.
What I say is, when it gets quiet,
Here,
Where'd you go? Thank you.
all right. So we can get right into police. If you think the 19% increase was bad. Wait till you look at the police. Couple of things about the police budget, though, that you need to be aware of. This front page that you're looking at is a little bit deceiving because the FY '23 budget, particularly the payroll, did not include any pay increases. So that payroll line item was based on FY '22 figures, not FY '23. We were in contract negotiations, and we had no idea where that was gonna land, so we were unable, so we didn't budget it. We also had vacancies, so we were confident that between the vacancies and that 1,027,000 figure, we would be able to cover our payroll expenses for FY '23. But the actual figure for FY '23 for payroll should have been, if you include the contractual increases that we experienced, it should have been $1,207,075. So that's a reflection of the actual payroll for this FY '23. For FY '24, in addition to contractual obligations for that, for payroll, I've also increased a $50,000 payroll line item for for the police chief in anticipation of the council's desire to divide my current role with the city. So in order to do that, it needs to be budgeted in the police payroll, because currently my entire salary comes from the city manager's budget. So there's $50,000 has been increased to that line item to cover that expense. As you work down through, there's no changes.
Did that get taken out of, sorry, did that get taken, no, because we don't
No,
know. We
'cause
have to
you-
basically count on both.
Right,
And it's.
because
for
you have a
half
city
year.
manager.
For
Maybe
half
half a year,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So as of January, when my contract ends, the anticipation would be that there'll be a city manager and a police chief, and you'll need to have compensation budgeted for both.
Right, but in theory, then the city manager's payroll will go down if that person is not doing two jobs.
I don't think so. I don't think you're gonna find a city manager that's gonna take the job for less than what I make, but
Yeah, we found during the recruitment process, that's what we found. The compensation wasn't set for both roles. It was set for what was competitive for a city manager, and the savings was the fact that we no longer had that that other position. So just going forward, it's half-year budgeted, but going into the next year, it's gonna increase the budget even more.
So you're basically like a volunteer police chief.
right, yeah, that's a good way to look at it, sure.
Paid on call.
Yeah, right, paid on call. So, yeah, kind of to answer your question, so the city manager's budget just reflects my pay rate. So in January, if I'm no longer the city manager, then whatever negotiated with the new city manager would be, it's gonna be unbudgeted for half the year, or a portion is likely to be unbudgeted. So if you work down through our overtime budgets, I did not adjust any of those. I think we could adjust the overtime payroll line item in anticipation that we will be full-staffed for the coming year. We do have one candidate who will be attending the academy in August, but shy of losing anyone, I think we may be able to reduce that to 80,000. I haven't done that yet, but I think that's something that we can certainly take a look at. Our court time increased slightly because we are seeing more and more opportunities for court. For a while, because of COVID, there was no court whatsoever. They're slowly bringing it back. Our officers are having to zoom in to traffic court, which when they're off is a mandatory 4-hour call-out pay. So we've brought back a little bit of money to make sure we cover those costs. Fitness stipend is just a reflection of fitness payroll is just a reflection of more officers, younger officers are engaging in the fitness test. and we have to schedule it and hold it during times when they're not on duty, so we need to compensate them for that. So that's just a reflection of more people taking the test. No change in the stipend. Our telephone, that's comes straight from IT, that's just increased cost in our expenses for phones and the equipment in our vehicles, the patrol vehicles. Office supplies, no change. Travel, we've eliminated due to the fact that we have police vehicles that folks use for trainings or any travel that they have to do. Dues and memberships, we've increased slightly, and that's just a reflection, unfortunately, well, not necessarily unfortunately, but of the times, of just more opportunity since COVID for memberships and dues to be paid. We have more of our command staff involved in the Maine Chiefs of Police Association, for just one example of the dues. We also have all of our command staff officers from corporals and above all receive FBI LEADA supervisory training, which is a 3-part course, and as a result of that, they can also be members of FBI LEADA, and so they receive updates, free webinars, and that sort of thing as a result of completing that training, and we require all of our supervisors to complete that. Training budget, we did not change. Conference and meetings, we increased, and that's a result, again, these artificially low numbers were a result of COVID, and there wasn't a lot of conferences and things, but now they've come back, and so particularly conferences we attend are the Maine Chiefs of Police conferences. We also attend, when there's pertinent information, the MMA conference. So both of those are that's covered for chief, deputy chief, and in many instances the captain as well for those trainings. Next line that was increased, vehicle maintenance, and this is just a sign of the times, unfortunately. Tires, for example, for our cruisers have doubled in price, so it's fairly minimal increase, but we think that will be adequate. And then gasoline we reduced slightly, and that's just hopeful that the gas prices will stay where they are or continue to decrease. Last year we increased it considerably because of the gas prices going up. We're currently over our gas budget, but I think we'll be all right in the future. And that's it for our operation costs, and then you get into the lease payment, and which is the major part of the increase, obviously. So that's a new line item for the building, the lease payment, and then that's the yearly total for that. And then in addition, I've added 2 new line items, one for utilities. I've estimated it at $10,000. What I did in order to get that figure is took a look at some other city-owned facilities and tried to do my best to estimate what we would likely use for fuel, water, wastewater, and those types, and electricity in that facility. So it's really just kind of a place card more than anything else, but based on what I saw from comparison of other facilities, the wastewater treatment plant being probably the most comparable as far as it's relatively new. It's obviously larger, consumes more energy because of the type of facility it is, but it gave me some insight into electrical use and where to maybe fall, and heating, where to fall that line. And then the other $10,000 is for maintenance and upkeep of the building. We'll be responsible for plowing, so there'll be potential costs there, cleaning of the facility, and again, those costs are unknown at this time, so I'm doing my best based on our estimates we got for cleaning of this facility and so forth to be able to put a figure there that I think is reasonable. Not excessive, but not under budgeted, so that we won't have any chance of keeping it. For capital outlay, that is earmarked for replacement of tasers. We currently have 16 of our tasers that are out of warranty, which means if they break or something happens to them, we have to replace the full cost of it. So the plan with that is to start a replacement schedule to replace several of those pieces of equipment to get so that we have them, they're back under warranty, and should something happen, we'll be able to get them repaired without having to buy a new one. Couple of things I wanted to touch base on. So it basically if you take the payroll, and I'm going to do kind of the fire chief thing too. If you take the payroll and the new building expenses out of the budget, you're looking at a $16,000 increase for operational budget for the police department. Questions?
Did anything come of the enterprise?
Yes.
So is that something?
It's still, we'll have a full presentation, and Captain Willie can certainly speak to that a little bit, but full presentation on that at the Capitol, because the cruisers
Okay.
fall under our capital expense. But we are still working towards that and hoping that the council will approve that. It will reduce our capital expense, obviously. It doesn't do anything to our operational costs for this year, because the majority, we'll be replacing several, but the majority of our vehicles will still be older, so we won't be able to necessarily reflect a savings in the vehicle maintenance for this budget cycle, but definitely for future budget cycles. And so just to bring those of you who aren't familiar up to speed, the police department is exploring the possibility with Enterprise to lease our police vehicles. So the entire fleet over the course of a few years would be exchanged for leased vehicles. They would sell our current vehicles, and we would receive compensation for the value of those vehicles, and that compensation would be put towards the lease of new vehicles. And it's much deeper than that. It's much more entailed than that, but I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on that tonight, because we're going to have, a full presentation on that for the capital budget workshop, which
Which is Wednesday.
which is
Right.
next week. No, not for that capital, that's with the school department, it's the city budget capital one.
A less lethal taser? That's the brand name, or what is it?
Taser is the brand name, less lethal is what the weapon system is qualified as.
Whatever that means.
I just haven't heard
Well,
that
it's like
phrase
less
before.
lethal than a gun, I assume.
Well,
Right.
that makes sense.
I mean, I just watch TV, so I don't know.
Does it hurt less?
Just a little bit, yeah.
We should, don't you want to volunteer?
To-
They can shoot you with both of them. And you
So-
can tell us if one's,
Actually, I do have a question about that, though. Does $10,000 pay for 16 tasers?
No. What are they, 20?
About half.
Yeah.
Pays for like 8 tasers?
Yeah.
And you're hoping to replace them all, or you wait till one breaks and then you wait till one breaks and then?
We'll replace the oldest ones first and kind of move forward. We might not replace all 8. I mean, if they're still working okay, then we're gonna keep using them.
Yeah.
Gonna move that way.
Yeah.
Has to be done at some point.
I was just thinking about the minute you figure out that the taser doesn't work.
It's too late, right? Well, no, they do testing with them, so.
Oh, okay.
Before their shifts, so. But we do, but when we purchase them, we purchase a 5-year warranty with them, so. The ones that are out of warranty are at least 5 years old, so.
The training expense is one of the bigger ones, so I was kind of drawn to it. I also remembered from our city tour, you showed me the facility and told me about the robust training activities. And I don't have a great reference point on this, except to look at other towns of similar size and see what their budgets are. And it seems like ours is larger than the few I looked up, Belfast and Bucksport. And I know you're passionate about the training. So my question is, how necessary is that in a town of our size with the sorts of calls that the police respond to and that sort of thing?
Well, I would consider it absolutely mandatory. You know, those, just the departments you listed are, you know, they're significantly smaller than Ellsworth. I mean, we've got, excluding myself, but including myself, I mean, we've got 20 sworn law enforcement professionals that we need to maintain training. And in addition to we have specialization, like our K-9 handler, our drone pilots, our drug recognition experts, our accident reconstructionists, all of those things that provide us tremendous value to our community, to be able to have those trained personnel amongst our department, as opposed to having to, you know, you consider a crash on 1A, and if we were forced to wait for an outside agency to come in to fly a drone, let's say, for our accident reconstructionist, instead of, you know, half-hour road closure, you could be looking at multiple-hour road closure. So, and those things impact our, you know, our community all over, whether it be people unable to get to work or tourists unable to get through to their destination. So that's just one example of how having those trained folks in our staff bring a tremendous value to our department, and to our community. But beyond that, our certification, our accreditation that we obtained, training is a big component of that, a large component of that. And, you know, just in today's society, when you talk about law enforcement and the need for law enforcement to be better trained at de-escalation and how to address the homeless population and LGBTQ population and all of these different sort of more recent stressors that are put upon our law enforcement officers, you know, we need to have the training funds available to be able to send our people to those specialized types of trainings. Online training is good, and we do a lot of it, but it doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, it doesn't do justice to some of these trainings and some of the classes as being in a room full of fellow law enforcement professionals from all over the state, where you have an opportunity to interact and ask questions, hear from, you know, true life examples of situations, things that have worked, things that haven't worked. So being able to send our people to training, I think, is paramount to our success, and is critical to the mission that we have in the police department, is to provide the highest level of, you know, service to our community. In addition to those reasons, you know, we also have, you know, a command staff who requires, you know, training to make sure that we're providing adequate and appropriate leadership for our personnel. And we have a very young department right now, you know, and, you know, we have about half of our agencies over 40, and then half is in their 20s. And so it's, you know, it's critical that as we move forward, that our training budget is robust enough to be able to provide that, you know, that leadership and the growth that we need with those younger officers to eventually replace those of us who are going to be retiring in the future. So, you know, there's a lot of training that goes into being a police officer, and being able to maintain that is something that, you know, the city has always dedicated funds to and always been very supportive of, and I think we need to continue that trend for the better, you know, for the best interests of our community.
Thanks.
Question?
My turn?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Same question. We've got a 30% increase over last year. Looks like, in addition to that, there's an increase in the capital budget of 232 ahead for another time. And then there's, I'm struggling with the 30%, I guess. Where do we, what are we delivering to Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer that we can justify 30%? I realize some of it is the normal things, but we've got to deliver this to Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer somehow.
So our capital request is only 146. So I did not bring forward the body cameras. That's the 232. The 146 is the cruisers, the two additional cruisers. We're replacing 2 cruisers. And that, again, we'll learn more about the prospect of that changing based on the potential for leasing.
Well, I guess this is another night, but I'm looking at 24 budget for 379 and 23 budget was for 146. In the capital outlay.
Yep, 146 is what we're asking for 24.
It says 23.
Well, that's a typo.
24 says 379.
Yeah, that's a typo. 379 is what was brought forward, was asked for in capital. But the right-hand column in your capital should say FY '24, it's a typo, it should say FY '24. But what you're looking at on the right-hand side are what, as the city manager, those are what capital improvement requests I've brought forward and recommended.
Okay,
So for police, it's 146.
so that's going to be a flat budget then for capital outlay.
Basically, this is, both of these columns are 24. One is
Right.
what the department, the left is what the department
Asked
asked for,
for,
the right is what you're
I've
recommending.
recommended.
And they're
Yep.
both 24.
So it's not a
And they're both
comparison.
24s.
They're
Yeah,
not
it's not a
23s.
comparison from year to year.
Okay. Okay, so that cuts that out of the situation. But it's still money that has to be added to this budget. So you got a 30% increase, and outside of that, you know, again, where do we deliver this to the taxpayer?
Okay.
30%. And in addition, the 1,092,000, where do I find that in this budget? You don't, because it come out of the build-out of the new police station.
Right.
That's not in the budget because it come from undesignated surplus?
Correct.
Is that
And
correct?
Right, and that
So
would be
that's-
FY '23 anyway, it wouldn't be in FY '24.
Right, but it doesn't show in the 23 budget?
Correct.
Okay.
Does not.
So that's just,
So-
that's, because it's surplus, it doesn't show as a cost to your
Correct.
police department?
Correct.
Okay, okay.
So, to answer, yeah, just highlight a couple of things. One is, again, to highlight that the 133,400 is the building expense of that increase.
Yep.
50,000 of the payroll increase, again, is the police chief. The remainder is contractual. And so there's a $16,000 increase to your operational budget. And I think that we're not outside of the new facility, which comes with a whole host of benefits to the community. Benefits being that it absolves the community of the liability of our current facility and the deficiencies with our current facility. OSHA violation amongst just a few, as well as the danger to our staff here in City Hall of the lawlessness that comes into the City Hall. Just on your way into the meeting tonight, I had to ask you to step away from one of the police cars that's parked out front that's got taped off that no one can go near because the back seat's full of fentanyl. So those are the types of activities that outside of a city hall where Mary and Jane public coming and going throughout the course of the day, those law enforcement activities are not safe for the general public to be exposed to. That's just one example. So the added value to our community of moving the police department out of this facility is that it absolves the community from that liability of something bad happening here at City Hall as a result of law enforcement activity here in the building and outside in the parking lot, and all of those deficiencies that have been identified. As far as our personnel goes, I think it goes without saying that a community this size, with the growth that we've experienced over the last few years, the fact that we haven't added any police personnel in at least the last 3 years is pretty significant. We've been able to do more with less. Our police officers are extremely busy. Our call volume is very high, but yet we still manage to provide a very high level of service to our community. We've received very few citizen complaints, which lets me know that our men and women are doing a good job out there in the community and serving their community. We were able to obtain our state accreditation, which to date only, I think, a handful of other departments have achieved throughout the state. So all that tells me that our police department is doing an outstanding job, and I think that this budget and continuing to fund them reflects that they do bring a tremendous amount of value to our community. And again, we aren't adding anything necessarily as a service that we provide to our community, just making sure that we continue to be able to provide a high level of service.
It's not about, to me, I'm just trying to get this, you look down through this budget, it looks reasonable, everyone's budget looks reasonable, but collectively, it's a lot, and when I see a 30% increase, I'm like, wow, this is a lot of money here. It's not about, I'm just trying to find the extra in this, and it looks like the lease is a small part of that. It just seems like a lot to ask Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer to pay a 30% increase, that's all. And again, I understand there's operational things, but when you put them all together collectively, it's tough to swallow. 30% is a lot.
Well, I think if you take the building out, then you dramatically reduce that 30%.
The building's not free.
Well, the 30% is based on, you gotta go back to what you said, the FY '23 should be 1.2 million. That's what it should be in terms of personnel expense. So that 30% is being compared to a number that was not accurate because of the negotiation. So it's really not a 30% increase over last year. So that's a piece of it. The other thing that I think it's an important discussion in terms of costs, and we're going to see this throughout. I know a little bit about service organizations, and the fact of the matter is that most of the costs in the city are personnel costs, period. And when you talk about a $16,000 increase in operations, that's all, everything else is personnel. Everything else is personnel. Fire, personnel. Public works, personnel. Yes, we have capital items and things like that, but when it comes to these budget increases, that's what we're seeing. And so I just think it's important when we have the discussion, and maybe it'd be useful information to have some sense of what happens if we reduce. So the fact of the matter is, if we want to reduce our budget as a city, then we need to cut personnel. So how many fire positions will we eliminate? How many police positions will we eliminate to bring that number down? That's really the question that we have to wrestle with in terms of if they're if there's no magic, I guess is the bottom line. There's no magic in reducing this. The reality is it's mostly personnel. I would bet it's probably 80% personnel. So if we're going to reduce this, we're talking about cuts, and I think it's our responsibility to be upfront with the community to say, if the community wants a lower budget, it means that we need to cut positions somewhere in the city. That's the only thing that we're going to realize savings. There's no way else to reduce this budget other than to cut positions, and that's just the reality. So that's a discussion I think as a council we end up having if we're talking about reducing a budget.
One final question about this is personal use of vehicles. Where are we at with that within this budget?
In what sense, sir?
How many vehicles, the fire department had 2. How many in the police department?
There are 3.
Three.
Yep.
So 12 grand a year is 36,000 bucks. And who are the three that get the vehicles?
The command staff, the captain and the deputy chief, and then the K-9 handler.
Okay?
Where are you getting 1,000? I didn't see that in the budget.
I'm sorry?
Where are you getting the $1,000 per vehicle per month?
I'm just using that as $1,000 per month vehicle cost. in
I know,
my
but
mind.
but
From personal experience, from the cost of the vehicles, the insurance, the use, the maintenance, the upkeep, the fuel.
we have that, these are vehicles that are in use, right?
Right,
Correct.
right, but I'm just saying that I'm using the number of $1,000 a month. If it's wrong, it's wrong. That's what it costs me to give a personal vehicle to an employee, to go back and forth to home. So there's only three? I thought there was four.
Well, you're counting mine, but mine's in the city manager contract.
Right, but it's in this budget.
The maintenance is covered
Right.
by the police
And
department.
the cost of the car is in this budget.
Cost in what sense?
Buying the car.
Well, it was a vehicle that was exchanged out of the fleet,
Okay.
so.
So there's four people in this budget that are using vehicles for personal conveyance, correct?
There are three in that budget. Because my vehicle is part of my city manager contract.
But maintained in this budget?
Correct.
Okay, and it was bought in this, somewhere in this police department?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Can I just, can we go back to the, what the real budget was for financial '23? Because I just wasn't understanding what you meant. So we approved the number that's typed in there, 1,027,027.
Correct. Yep.
But you're saying what it actually cost was 1.2, or what it will cost when all is said and done?
Well, no, because, no, so after the contract was approved,
Yeah,
when you figure, when you calculate the positions and the staff at that new pay rate, the potential cost is $1,207,075 for all of the positions under the new contract.
the new
We-
contract, which we approved when?
It was approved in September, I think, August.
retro, right?
It was retro, so it wasn't effective on July 1, which is why it wasn't included in this budget.
Yeah, okay.
The budget, we are currently under this 1,027,000 spent and should land somewhere around that number when the year end comes, because we had vacancies that went unfilled until recently. And so there were savings in our payroll that enabled us to stay within that 1,027,000.
I see what you're saying. You're saying because we are now, are we fully staffed?
staffed, yes.
Because we are now fully staffed, that accounts for some of the increase, because if we had been fully staffed last year, okay, I
Yeah,
just didn't
you
get
got
that.
it.
Okay.
Yep. Any other questions on police? All right, move on to dispatch. Towards the back.
So telephone in police is not dispatch, telephone is sort of like a
Cellular.
fire where each vehicle or each officer
Yep.
will have its own.
Yeah, so every officer contractually is provided a city cell phone, a city-owned cell phone, and then our cruisers have 11 of our cruisers have computers, which require cell service as well. Dispatch services, again, you're seeing significant increase in the payroll as a direct reflection of the contract negotiation. We have 4 dispatchers now. We added the 4th last year in FY '23. All 4 are working now and trained. The last one is finishing up his training, so shortly all 4 will be fully trained. As a result, we increased the holiday overtime line item slightly just to cover that additional employee's holiday pay. And going down through office supplies, we increased slightly. And outside of that, the only other increase we had, there was an increase to the professional services, and that's contractual obligation to the Hancock County RCC for our overnight dispatch services that they provide from 11 PM to 7 AM. So that reflects their annual increase to that contract. And then there was a $1,000 increase to office equipment and maintenance, and a slight increase to the uniform purchase, and that's to reflect the additional employee and the need to purchase their clothing. Outside of that, very little increase. I would state again, that 22% increase is inflated. The budget figures for FY '23 for that payroll I didn't actually do out that math, but it should be significantly higher than that 186, because that 186 does not reflect last year's contract increases. And if you remember, with the police contract last year, there was a $3 increase, and what's called an add drop, where you drop a step, which is about it translates to about a $3.50 to a $3.75 increase per employee. And the dispatchers are covered under our police negotiation, our police contract. So they receive the same benefit as the police department. So they each received a $3 an hour pay increase on average. So, and that's not reflected in that 186. So that increase from year to year is less than what it looks like here.
Can you remind me what are the hours of our dispatch versus when we go to the Hancock County?
So our dispatchers work 12-hour shifts. So we have 4 shifts, 7 to 7 and 11 to 11. And so they overlap. So from 7 to, from 11 to 7, there's two folks working. And then at 11 PM, we transfer over to the RCC, and they cover it with 3 people from 11 PM to 7 AM.
There was an additional staffer added,
Last year.
but just to cover existing daytime hours, not to take over. Is it a goal at all to ever eventually take over the 11 to 7 RCC?
No. We've been back and forth with it. It's still a significant savings if you compare the 35,000 to even if we just added 1 personnel to cover that shift. You're talking about, anywhere from 75 to 80,000 for an employee to cover that time period. And then you still, you only got 40 hours a week. You still got 20 hours a week you got to make up. So, for economics reasons, it still doesn't make sense. I think certainly our personnel would argue that there's some reasons to do it. But at this point, I think it's still economically wiser to stay with the RCC for the midnight dispatch. And in addition to just the money increase, it also adds a whole new, it adds a whole new element as far as getting people to work that midnight shift is difficult. And we are one of the few 24-hour police services in the area. The only one that the RCC dispatches for. So, they have the capacity to handle our call volume overnight. In addition, they answer all of the 911 calls. So some of our increase in dispatch was a direct reflection of our EMS response and the additional call volume that's put on our dispatchers, because every 911 call is initiated by the RCC, but then it's transferred to our dispatch to tone out our fire department, and then they maintain radio communications with our fire department. So that 1,300 plus calls that the fire chief talked about earlier, all come through our dispatch center that weren't there before, previously. So that was kind of what, partially what motivated the need for an additional staff member, coupled with the fact that our police calls for service continue to climb. On average, they're increasing several hundred each year for our calls for service. So there's no decline in our calls for service on the police side, and with the addition of the EMS, it added a significant burden on the one person who was answering calls in there. So, which is why we staff it with 2 now, and so if we brought back midnight dispatch at some point, it just makes it increasingly more difficult to staff that position and maintain staffing, because that's a tough job to fill.
You said every year the police get 700 more calls.
Not 700, no, but we increase consistently, probably between 300 and 500 calls a year of service increase,
Every year.
year after year. Yep.
That's
We saw that, we saw a downward trend during COVID, but since COVID, our trends are going, are arcing back upwards, for sure.
I think it's quiet, you should go. Move
Well,
on.
I think Mr. O'Halloran is still contemplating.
I just have, is it safe to say, is everyone in a partial agreement that there's 8,400 residents in Ellsworth?
84 to 86?
Thereabouts, somewhere, yeah, okay. I don't have anything.
Okay. Well, that's all we have for tonight.
The rest,
Where does,
I thought the rest of it was, you're not gonna go through the rest of it?
That's all for public safety, just police, fire, and dispatch.
there were just these pages that are like public fire protection, street lights.
Oh,
in
okay,
that
I
same-
apologize.
How
I
does,
There's no increases, but they are costs.
apologize.
I didn't know, I guess I didn't know where fire hydrants came from.
I didn't know that till last year myself.
It's, we pay ourselves.
Aha, we rent them to ourselves.
We have to, because it's a public, it's an enterprise account.
Okay. Fascinating.
Yeah, we can take a quick look at those budgets. There isn't any increase. Most of those go unchanged from year to year. One thing public fire protection, our rentals, for our fire hydrants, kills me every time. And the water bill's even worse, but we won't get into that tonight because it's not part of this budget.
But although, Council Stein raised it, I don't know how many people are watching, but it's always helpful to understand it because it's convoluted. But in short, and correct me if I misstate, because it's an enterprise account that is paid by the ratepayers, we, as a city, utilize the hydrants and the water that comes out of it. And so there's this formula, or I think it's a formula-based method for the taxpayers to pay for the use of the water on a fee basis, much like the ratepayers pay. And if the city didn't pay for that, taxpayers for that, then it would be ratepayers would be picking up the cost of.
Water rate.
Right. So,
Yep.
and I say that for the public to
And-
understand.
And just to clarify that, what I learned was we're paying for the capacity available, not the water used. We're paying for it to be available to us, is what I understood in the previous education that I received. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm not the water guy. I'm
Okay.
not 100% sure on that.
Well, that's
but-
what I
but
learned when I questioned it
believe that
before.
that's probably true, because we're not flowing water, but.
Right, but it's available to us.
And our, so our,
Crystal clear?
Yeah.
It's all these hidden things that.
It's fascinating, but it makes sense.
so streetlights. We had, it's unchanged there. I think we can change that, based on a couple of things. One is based on, savings as a result of solar. We haven't adjusted for solar. And the other thing is, I know in Jason's capital budget is a plan to convert, LED conversion, which would also allow us to see significant savings in that line item. So that's one that I have highlighted that is still kind of a work in progress. I didn't change it because I don't have the exact solar figures, and I'm waiting to see if the capital is approved to move forward with LED conversion, then that number will definitely change as a result of that.
Yeah, now would be a great time to do the conversion because we recoup the cost from the solar.
Does Public Works manage those?
Nope, Jason, IT.
That's-
Yeah, I mean,
But,
he does, but unfortunately, when we have maintenance work that's required on the lights themselves, he does a lot of the work in the cabinets and the timing and that sort of thing, but the electrical stuff, we have to use an electrician, and the stuff on the lights actually up in the sky has to be done is outsourced by a company to come in, an electrician. So that stuff is expensive. Our maintenance budget's relatively low because a lot of our lights are new, and it's not anticipated that we need to do a lot of maintenance other than cleaning and that sort of thing.
but they are city-owned, they're not owned by
Correct.
Versant or?
Yep.
Can you remind me where this Ellsworth Harbor one fits?
Yeah, it's got its own tab.
Oh, it does.
It doesn't in
I'm
my
sorry,
book.
it's not, doesn't have its own tab, it's under recreation.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes in the back of recreation. It's a little out of sync because you'd think it would be Lisa and Highway, but it goes under recreation. And I misspoke, John, I was confusing my traffic lights and my traffic signals. So the traffic lights themselves are owned by the power company. In some cases, we do own some, like.
The streetlights.
The streetlights, I'm sorry, yes, the streetlights. Like Myrick Street, for example, we own those, and we just did a conversion on those this fiscal year, so those are all LED now. But as part of the conversion, there are options that we buy the heads, and Versant puts them on their poles, so there are different options that Jason has explored, and he'll explain more of that during that capital process to do that LED conversion. But we do not own the majority of the streetlights, the power company does. But traffic signals is what I was referring to. Traffic signals is what Jason maintains for the city, not the streetlights. And the power, again, this is a power line that we can adjust based on savings that we've experienced with solar. I haven't adjusted it yet, but it's a work in progress to figure that savings out. And the maintenance budget has not changed for that one.
And the only thing that I think we should probably discuss, even though it's unchanged, is there is a cost if we want to explore the timing of the lights, especially addressing down here at the intersection, which has come up a number of times by over many years, pedestrians, and that there's a cost to doing some of that, and if we don't budget for it, it won't happen. So I just want to put that out there, that may be something we need to discuss in order to correct that issue.
That is the last budget for tonight.
I forgot to ask if we could budget in a new fuzzy topper for my microphone because it keeps disintegrating on my.
less lethal.
Maybe we just.
I put it back,
Maybe
but
we
it
just
just
swap
makes
it out. I
sense.
think we have some other microphones down underneath, so maybe we just swap it out for one that's not disintegrating.
I just want to point out one thing for the record, and I keep getting back to numbers, and I realize when you go through the numbers, it's hard to cut. But the increased budget for the police department is $456,000 for a round number, divided over 8,400 residents. That means each resident needs to bring $54.32 extra to City Hall for this budget over last year. The fire department, $296,000 over 8,400 residents. Every resident needs to bring an extra $35.35 to City Hall for that budget. Dispatch, every resident needs to bring $6.75 to City Hall. I'm not saying it's avoidable, but collectively, it's over $90 that just in tonight, in extra costs that people have to bring to City Hall. Every person, 8,400.
But the total city budget is only up 8%. So they wouldn't have to bring that much money to City Hall.
I'm
because
talking
they'd
about
only
these
bring
budgets.
8%.
Talking about these budgets, right here. These individual departments,
But you,
what they're asking for.
okay, but you can't take individual departments, and
We're here to talk about individual departments.
we're here to work on the budgets for individual departments, but
Right.
you can't extract them out of the budget and isolate them and say, this is the increase, because other budgets have
I'm-
decreased.
What I'm saying is that's what the departments are asking for this evening, is they're asking every resident to bring $54.32 in the police department. Just because other departments are helping that number, doesn't mean that you're not asking for that money. I'm just bringing that up, because when you start talking about every resident and how much they have to bring to each department, increases are a lot.
And this is not directed at you, this is directed at us. At this point, the city manager and the staff have zero control about what happens next. It's up to the council. And if there are proposals, I certainly hope, that's why we have budget workshops. That, and I know last year it didn't happen in terms of, to a large extent. If there are proposals about how to address that concern, we need to talk about that, wherever we stand on that issue. We probably will disagree. It's not up to the city manager to do that. It's up to us.
I'm not saying any different, I'm
I
just
did,
saying.
and I just said it, I wasn't directing it at you. You
I'm
raised
just
a
saying
point.
that that is reality of these budgets.
Right,
And
and.
others
just
to come.
Just, yeah, and I just,
I'm
that's
not
why.
directing it at any one, I'm saying,
I did-
look, it's a
Councilor Heller,
cost.
I wasn't, and that's why I said it, because I didn't want you to take it personal. I'm saying what your point about the increase, I hear it, I understand it. We all have different ideas about that. What I'm saying, and I hope that the whole council understands, is that's in our hands. If there are proposals to discuss, then that's what we need to do. So if we individually feel like this is too much, we have a responsibility to come to the table and say, you know what, I recommend that you cut 3 police officers, you cut 4 fire positions. That's what we need to do. But if we're not going to do that, then we're not doing our job in terms of we either agree with what's presented or we put alternatives on. It's not up to the manager at this point to make any changes to the budget. That's up to us.
Question. I understand as we get to budget voting, what we'll see as a council eventually will be the complete budget, which we'll vote to approve or to not approve. And so at that point, we'll no longer be able to sort of dive into individual department budgets for individual changes. This would be the time for recommendations, is that how
It's
it
time for
works?
recommendations, but no, when it comes to, you can say, I make a motion to cut 3 policemen and have this be the budget, and then it almost gets voted on like,
The goal in the workshops is to try to, we're not taking votes, but to try to come to some consensus. So if I'm concerned about any one of these departments, I should say, I'm concerned about the cost of this, and I think what we should do is X, Y, Z. And we have a discussion, and we kind of take the temperature. Does it seem like we have consensus? And if it does, that allows the city staff to bake that into the budget, so when they present the final budget, all of these ideas have already come forth. If we wait until the final night, if we don't have discussions in the workshop, then we really haven't done due diligence. So it's really a process, but when we get to the final you can still make
Like, because that didn't
recommendations.
happen
Yeah,
last year.
exactly.
Someone made a motion to make a change, for example, on the library budget on the day that we voted for the budget, and then that change got voted in on that day. Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons we changed the cycle this year, was to give us more time as a council to have some discussions.
To
and not-
understand really
yeah,
what things mean on the
exactly.
lines, yeah.
Yeah, because once you get a first glimpse of it and hear the department heads and understand the, the numbers and the figures, then it's hopeful that you'll have the opportunity to reflect on possible suggestions. I mean, because ultimately, that's what we're looking for. Because what I've done is I've gotten the information from the individual department heads. I've worked with the department heads, worked with the finance department to put together what I think is a reasonable budget in order to maintain the level of service that we currently offer here at the city of Ellsworth. And I believe this is these budgets are what we need to be able to maintain that service. And if folks around this table, who ultimately have the final say, think otherwise, or think that there are changes that could be made in order, and then we need to have that discussion, and then I can work with the staff to be able to provide you with specific information as to what those changes will result in. What, if any, levels of service are we going to be losing out by being forced to make certain cuts and certain changes. I would say, very simply, an example of that is tonight with your question about training in the police department. And I think that, answered that question to the best of my ability, just without, doing a little bit of homework as to what the ramifications, I believe, would be to our department and to our city if we were to reduce that spending item. So that's kind of the goal.
Yeah.
And to my point, I like to look at it, what we're asking for Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer to pay. I'm not saying that we don't need these services, but I want everybody to be mindful that how much extra we're asking of people's budgets that are strained. Everyone in this city has a strained budget, I'm sure, over 2 years ago, just like you folks are going. You're trying to quantify this, but don't forget that everything we do, we've got to reach out and ask for money from the city. And they've got the same problems. The residents have the same problems. And I just like everyone to be mindful of that. That's why I say what I say.
Certainly, at some point, there's other levers we can pull when we look at the entire budget. There's TIF funding potentially, and I'd love to hear more. This isn't the meeting for it, but when we get to that point where we're looking at the overall mill rate, the overall burden, it seems there are other levers to be pulled. There's potential grant funding, there's potential TIF funding, ARPA funding that could ease that burden overall once we've sort of agreed what we're all willing to approve as the total budget. Am I wrong? Is that how it works, or?
Well, we'll work through the TIF budget. The TIF is very restrictive on what it can be used for. So it doesn't offer a lot of opportunity within the general operation budget of the city to impact. Certainly ARPA, we can look at ARPA, especially when we get into the capital improvement portion of the budget for potential spending items there. When we talk about local roads, there's some potential there for not funding projects, but giving the green light on projects to move forward with potential attempting to find funding sources, be it, MPI with DOT, that sort of thing. So there's conversations that can be had around ways to save money there. For general operation costs, I don't think we have a lot of grant funding or other opportunities that are gonna allow us to offset those costs. Because even ARPA funding is pretty clear that if it's a budgeted expense, you can't replace budgeted expenses with ARPA money. So operation costs are pretty much just kind of baked in the cake. It is what what they are. And to Dale's point, when you look down through the budget, pretty consistently, 80% of your increases are staffing related. And the only way you're going to be able to significantly impact the bottom line, if you will, or the ultimate price of what we provide to the city, the services we provide to the city, is going to be reduced staffing. And that's a challenge.
And perhaps reduce staffing, maybe that's not in these departments, maybe it's somewhere else, maybe it's not, maybe there's a shortage of staff. I mean, so there's, just, when you talk about staffing, it doesn't have to come from these departments. There's a huge array of departments, but again, it looks to me like every department is just skimming by. Doesn't look like there's any amount of people that are twiddling their thumbs. It looks like everyone is doing more than they did 5 years ago. So, I mean, where do you go?
True statement.
Every business has that problem.
Move to adjourn.
No
No
adjournment
one's
necessary. but
Thanks so much, everybody.
See you all Wednesday night.
All right, so Harbor goes into
We can see where
recreation.
trashy stuff.
I don't want